Okay, we're now recording. So, um, when we talk about the American Empire, I guess it's important to figure out what is an empire in the first place, right? So, this is a picture of the Roman Empire, which is like a classic empire that people think of when they think of empires. Um, what it is really though is it's a political organization where you have a dominant central state that controls the weaker peripheral outer states. So in the context of Rome, you can see that this is like what they called all of the known world, or basically all of the Mediterranean sort of universe um, at the time. And Rome, you can see, is just a tiny little dot right there north of Sardinia, I guess. And the people who were born in Rome were citizens of Rome. And so it was a quote unquote democracy, and they had political control over what was going on in Rome, but they also sort of projected that power all over this giant area. And the citizens of Gaul and Britain and Spain, obviously, and Egypt did not get an equal vote in the Roman government or anything like that. So key aspect of an empire is you have this strong central area that's sort of projecting power and controlling territory and conquering territory on its periphery. That's kind of what I just said, but basically citizens from the core are treated very differently than people from the outer regions or the imperial possessions or territories. And the key element here is control, right? Like, how does one small area exert control over another area, right? And it's like, does an empire express its political power and its political will on these other regions that it controls? That's what we're going to try to look at. And of course, we also want to answer the question of why do empires exist, or like how is this useful for empires to be created, or what are the motivations for different states to create empires. And so we're going to try to go through some of those during this little talk here. And so this is an interesting question because I think, like, what does a map of America really look like, right? And so we have here, I found this little GIF that like explains exactly, kind of like does a little animation of like how the United States, which started as just like the 13 colonies, like over time was expanded in order to become sort of like the logo that we understand as like the continental United States today, right? And I just think that it's important to remember that this all kind of happened through conquest, and it didn't just sort of snap into being, that it was sort of a long period of conquest, of taking land away from Mexico and Spain, and of course, obviously, the indigenous people who lived here before any colonialism even started. But usually they don't count westward expansion on the continent as like colonialism or imperialism because you didn't have to cross the sea. But that's kind of like not super. I don't know. That's not really a meaningful distinction if you think about it too much. Like, it doesn't change any of the dynamics of like how the conquest occurred. So over the course of this whole time, you get a sense that this is the shape of the United States of America today, and this is kind of like what we think of as like America, right? But that certainly isn't the only places that America exerts influence in the world, and in fact is the dominant military and political force. So this other map that I have here is in pink are all the countries where the United States military currently has a presence, which is pretty shocking if you think about it. Like, for some reason, the U.S. and Alaska aren't, or the continental United States and Alaska aren't pink. But if you imagine those as pink, basically what you have is the entire Western Hemisphere, at least half of Africa, all of Western Europe, all of the Middle East, and basically almost lots of Southeast Asia, obviously Japan and Korea after World War II, Australia. All of these countries could basically be seen as like extensions of United States military control and under the dominion of U.S. military hegemony directly. And through its various economic levers, the United States exerts an extreme amount of influence over almost every single country in the world, with the exception of China and Russia to a great degree, who can maybe, I think, are the only two countries on the world you can credibly say are like have the strength and the power to resist United States influence, broadly speaking. So I think that the point of these two slides is just to give you guys an idea of like the scale of US imperial dominion on the planet, right? The United States empire is by far the largest and most powerful empire in the history of the world, full stop. And that's not even really a controversial point at all. So if I told you that empires are all about control, how does the US exert its control over the world, right? The first and most obvious way is with overt military force or violence, which is obviously violence, right? Like we kill people all over the world. We are currently using, this is a picture of a Predator drone, which I think is kind of like the insidious modern way that the United States likes to conduct war, because you can basically just have a guy playing a video game in Arizona, killing people in many countries in the Middle East and Africa. Today, I think it's like at least 7 countries that we're actively bombing at the moment today. Which, if you ask the average American citizen how is the U.S. at war right now, they probably wouldn't say that the U.S. is in 7 different wars right now. But tell you what, if you're a person living on the ground in one of those countries and you're getting bombed, I'm sure it certainly feels like a war to you. Of course, in addition to the overt military actions, which involve sort of like bombs and troops of people wearing sort of the American flag and the uniform, there's also obviously insane amounts of covert CIA operations that occur around the world, from coups to election tampering to assassinations, or just any type of crazy shit that you could imagine the CIA gets up to. They're very, very active around the world, trying to shape the political events and control the politics and the economic destinies of countries around the world. Economic coercion uh, is another very important tool of empire, and I guess like the most obvious thing that you think of with this is sanctions, right? Like we put like I guess a good example is like the embargo on Cuba, right? We're still mad at them for things that happened in the 1950s and the 1960s, and so we, even though they're a small island nation that's not very far off the coast of the United States, we stop them from getting some of the necessary supplies that they need. And this is also violence because this is a direct, U.S. sanctions in Venezuela and in Iraq in the early 90s, most famously, have very, very high body counts in terms of the amount of starvation that it caused and the amount of just like destruction, sickness, lack of medical supplies. There's a really, really high body count from this kind of force. And so I think it's important to remember that the human cost of these kinds of things. In addition to those kind of like hard edges of control, the United States also uses quote unquote international organizations to sort of enforce its will upon smaller, less powerful countries, including like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which make sure that sort of smaller countries' governments are sort of in this like permanent subservient debt relationship to United States and Western European financial interests. Which totally sucks. I think Greece, the example of Greece in the last 20 years is, if you want to know more about that, go look up what is going on with that country, but probably don't have time to talk about everything. The challenge here for me with this thing is not to talk about every single example of U.S. imperialism because it's very difficult, but to try to give you the broad strokes of the idea of the scale and scope of what we're talking about here. So NATO, the IMF, NAFTA. So these kinds of laws and treaties also include military alliances like NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is basically the United States and all the Western European countries who opposed the USSR. And NAFTA and other sort of trade agreements, which sort of make the world safe for capital and for American corporations to do business in the way they want around the world. And in addition to those organizations, right, the United States is primarily responsible for setting up the global financial system. And as a result of this sort of like being able to write the rules of the game financially, the United States, most of the world is dealing with on very uneven footing with us, like financially. And to sort of the brief encapsulate, obviously that's a very complex topic as well, but I will just give the example of the petrodollar. So basically in global markets, it's the only currency that you can use to buy oil is dollars, which means, and the only place that you can get dollars is from the government of the United States of America. So if you're a country who needs oil, aka you're a country who has any energy needs at all today in the year 2020, you need to get dollars from the United States government, right? So we have this currency relationship with the rest of the world where the US dollar is the global reserve currency, which is kind of encapsulates this unequal economic relationship between the United States and the rest of the world, particularly countries that might make up what you call the third world or the global south or whatever. So, talking about the military force, what are a list of countries where the United States has done what we call a regime change, right? Because all these countries where I showed you the big pink map of the United States, they supposedly have their own governments, right? They're not formally under United States control. But if they sort of say elect a leader that the United States doesn't like, or for whatever reason have some kind of a leadership or some kind of a government regime that the United States doesn't want to see succeed, then we will make sure that that government gets out the door and put a new government in that sort of likes us a little bit better. So I'll just give you a few examples here. Since World War II, we have China, Albania, East Germany, Iran, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Syria, Egypt, Indonesia, British Guiana, Iraq, North Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Ecuador, Congo, France, Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Bolivia, Indonesia, Ghana, Chile, Greece, Costa Rica, Bolivia, Australia. You got some repeats on here in case the asterisk means it worked. There's no asterisk, that means it didn't work, but we tried anyway. Bolivia, Australia, Angola, Zaire, Portugal, Jamaica, Seychelles, Chad, Grenada, South Yemen, Suriname, Fiji, Libya, Nicaragua, Panama, Bulgaria, Albania, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yugoslavia, Ecuador, Afghanistan, again, Afghanistan so many times, Venezuela, Iraq again, 2003, Haiti in 2004, Somalia in 2007, Libya in 2011, Syria in 2012. I think this list stopped at like 2012. I would also add Ukraine in 2014, and of course, Bolivia 2019. So these are just a few of the examples of places where we have overthrown the governments in the countries. It's fun that there are repeats. Notice that there are a lot of countries in Europe. Usually you think about this kind of stuff happening in like Latin America, but we've definitely been happy to meddle in countries in Europe when it when it suits us. And yeah, you get why I think it's a total joke when people are like, oh my God, Russia and China are meddling with our election because, just look at this list here. That's kind of our bag, right? So why? Why do we do these regime change operations? Why do we try to overthrow nice, friendly governments in tiny countries around the world that most Americans probably couldn't even find on a map if they tried, right? Well, one is for materialist reasons, right? So just straight up financial and material gain. Natural resources are a huge reason why the United States wants to do all these wars, right? Oil, right? All of the war on terror and stuff like that was mostly about trying to secure oil, which is A, profitable for the companies that produce and sell oil, and also B, in the general strategic interests of the United States to sort of have quote unquote energy security or whatever, if you believe in any of that. Lithium is a very interesting one. That is one of the articles I sent out, and one of the things that's kind of popping off right now was in 2019, there was a coup in Bolivia, and they overthrew the nice indigenous man with great hair named Evo Morales, who was a member of the movement for socialism there. And, famously, Elon Musk tweeted, we'll coup whoever we want, because the reason why they're trying to do a coup in Bolivia is that it is home to one of the largest lithium mines or mine systems, whatever, in the world, which is very important for electric cars and to make those lithium ion batteries. But it's not even just that. Wars have been fought over guano, which is literally bird shit. The Spain almost fought a war in South America over little tiny islands with bird shit on them because that was used as farm fertilizer. So, for the profit benefit of specific U.S. corporations. So the United States government has no problem doing a coup on behalf of specific companies. Like the annexation of Hawaii was for the specific benefit of Dole. The overthrow of the Shah or installation of the Shah, whatever happened in 1959 in Iran, I forget. It goes both ways because there's the revolution and the Shah and all that stuff. But was for the specific benefit of British Petroleum. So a lot of times these wars are on behalf of specific interests of like friends of politicians. For strategic geopolitical reasons, this is just like the war stuff. Like the most obvious is like the United States still controls like the zone around the Panama Canal, which is important because if you want to like ship stuff from the East Coast to the West Coast, we need to like have the Panama Canal. So we conquer this little tiny area in the jungle in order to do that. And there are also like many ideological reasons for the continued expansion of this empire, right? Anti-communism was one major reason why we did all these coups in the post-war period during the Cold War. Like we went to Vietnam to like stop communism or whatever, and look where that got us, right? White supremacy. I think it's very important to like when you hear things like spreading democracy or spreading the way of like American government or Western European sort of ideas about government and rights and freedoms and the free market and stuff like that. When you bring that sort of ideology to places where that's not the normal political history, that really it's connected to colonialism and it's totally 100% a white supremacist project, right? Like Mike Pence and guys like that, they honestly believe that we're in like a civilizational war against Muslim people, right? Like that's what they think. We're at war with Islam. So that's a major motivation. And just power for power's sake, right? Like people, I mean, this one goes back to the beginning of time, right? Like people want power and they're willing to do anything to get it, right? So, and some people, I think these are like the Obama kinds of people, just honestly believe that the world is a better place under United States hegemony, right? And that's when you'll hear things like U.S. leadership around the world, like U.S. has to be like a strong leader around the world, and that's what this is, right? That's what this is. So propaganda and media cooperation, like it's very important to understand like how the media is like really in on this kind of issue and these kinds of issues in particular is like egregiously bad, right? Like no, we don't like the mainstream media in general, but like they're like kind of the worst on this kind of stuff. Basically, Democrats, Republicans, and the mainstream media all agree that U.S. imperial wars are on the whole good. Maybe they'll say that there are some good ones and some bad ones, but in general, they all kind of believe that last point that the world is a better place, like if the U.S. is sort of dominating it. And so here's a bunch of headlines from like Western news about Bolivia's Evo Morales, quote unquote, resigning. And I'll just tell you that the military came to his house and shot his dog and he fled to Mexico City. So if someone came to your house and shot your dog, I don't think you would feel that you had resigned from your position. It was a coup. But they can't use the word coup because the word coup is only for people who are bad. Only bad people do coups, and the United States is not bad. Therefore, it wasn't a coup, right? So the media uses lots of specific words to describe each side of the conflict and gently guide your sympathy and anger, right? So if you say that like the president resigned because the election was questionable or something like that, then you think that the president was a bad guy. But if you say a coup happened, you think, oh, okay, the military deposed somebody, they must be the bad guy. So they use sort of like the little words to sort of cue your emotional sympathies to make sure that your sympathies still sort of line up with the United States interests. Spreading freedom or supporting democracy are also phrases that you should watch out for. And they never use the word dictator to support for anybody who the U.S. supports. So like the king of Saudi Arabia is literally a hereditary monarchy. Like that's a dictator, but you would never hear people use the word dictator or dictatorship to describe what's happening in Saudi Arabia. And this one, which is a classic move that I think we're all familiar with as it relates to like police violence, is use of passive voice, right? So they use the passive voice in order to like make it seem like 10 Iraqis died in explosions that happened somewhere in Iraq, when it's like, okay, they were killed by United States troops or whatever. It's like same thing as like citizen was ran into a bullet in a police-involved gun incident or something like that. You know what I mean? It's that kind of bullshit. And so what are the consequences abroad? Millions are directly killed in United States wars of aggression, right? Like 3 million, I think, 1 million dead in Iraq. No one knows how many dead in Vietnam. We don't even bother to count it. And I think that sort of the passive attitude like of most Americans is like, I think it's very, I honestly feel that it's morally important to keep in mind sort of the victims of this, because this is sort of the price of our empire, right? Genocides and other human rights abuses, right? Like the genocide in Indonesia, you know, that list of countries includes many, the list of countries I had on the slides before includes many war crimes, many really terrible things. Human rights abuses run rampant. This picture, of course, is a famous picture from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, where United States troops were basically doing insane torture to Iraqis during the war in like 2005. And that's not even, I mean, I encourage you to go look at those pictures just to remember sort of what happened. Immigration and refugee crises, right? Like, so we start these wars and, you know, like people like Donald Trump complain about, want to build a wall on the border because of immigration from Central South America. And the reason that those people are fleeing is because a lot of those countries don't have stable or sufficient governments, or have a lot of crime or have a lot of problems. But the governmental situation in all of those countries is directly the responsibility of United States policy to do all those coups and keep those governments unstable and everything like that. So, you know, it's our wars and our policies that cause the conditions that cause people to migrate. Millions are kept in poverty, right? And millions suffer under brutal regimes. I think that, like, you know, you look at our world, the way that our world works today, and, you know, in America, we have nice, happy lives on the whole, relatively, compared to like millions of people who live in poverty and food insecurity and infectious disease and really just horrible, you know, horrible poverty around the world. And so why is it that some people on one side of an imaginary line that's drawn on a map have sort of better lives than people on the other side of that line? And I think that we just kind of accept that because that's the world that we live in, but you got to understand that that's an intentional construction of the world by the people who sort of run this empire, right? What are some of the consequences at home? Immigration and refugee crises, right? Those are consequences abroad that come home to us. Imperial occupation, equipment, and techniques come home to police forces, right? So here you have a SWAT team with a literal tank, which, like, what could you possibly be doing in the suburbs that requires a tank? But famously, there's the Pentagon 1033 program, which funnels equipment down from the military to police forces. So a lot of the militarization of the police that we've seen, especially in the last 20 years, can be sort of traced back to this forever war and the war on terror. Surveillance, right? Like everything that the fact that you get like groped and assaulted every time you have to go board an airplane. You know, we live in sort of a security state that's sort of based in this imperial logic that impinges upon your personal freedoms and privacies. Truly unfathomable amounts of military spending in the United States. It's greater than $700 billion per year. Which is like, it's just so much money. We can't even comprehend it. It's so much money. And like, so here's a little pie chart that shows like the federal budget. Like the military is over 50% of the entire federal budget. And so if you want to know why we don't have enough money for Medicare for all or for any of those good fun things that we see on that left-hand side, it's because this is where all the money is going, right? So these are some of the reasons why, even if you're selfish and un-American who only cares about what's going on in America, the imperial situation is also bad for you. So all that being said, what are some of the key takeaways that I want to make? Because I guess I am aware that like many people like Cameron and like some other folks, you know, don't pay attention to this stuff. Don't pay attention to all this stuff because it's like it can be very boring. Sometimes I don't find it boring, but I can understand how you can find it boring. I guess these are the things that I want you to remember if you don't remember anything else about this topic, right? The U.S. empire is the largest and most powerful empire in the history of the world, right? So the scale and the scope of the United States empire is truly shocking. The U.S. is and always has been the aggressor. The U.S. is the greatest threat to world peace on the globe, not Iran and not North Korea, right? Like that, you know, if you listen to the mainstream media, they would have you believe that like there are crazy people all over the world and you're unsafe and that you need this giant empire in order to protect you against the crazy people who are out there. And that is just hogwash, malarkey, not true. The United States is super aggressive and super violent and responsible for most of the death that is occurring at the hands of like military around the world. Most US presidents are war criminals, right? Like you saw that list of countries, you saw all those years. That basically means that this stuff has been going on under every single president, including Obama. They're all war criminals. And if they were held to the same standard as other people in the world, they would all be taken to The Hague and thrown in jail. I want you to try to learn to see through the US propaganda so that you have a little bit of skepticism when you see headlines about this stuff and know some of the tricks that they will try to do to try and like trick you into thinking supporting the US government line. I think that this stuff is like very important. If you understand this broader historical context, you can have a good comeback to like when people like your parents or maybe someone else say, we tried socialism and it didn't work. And it's like, well, every time if there was one of the countries where it might have worked, we did a coup against them. So it's not really fair to say it didn't work when like you can't say a government didn't work if someone just lost a war, right? Like you took an L. It's not that your system like naturally collapsed. I don't know. I hate it when people say that. This stuff is important to having a comeback to that little argument that people say. That this is the macro expression of white supremacy, right? So what the United States government does to these smaller countries is sort of like the same thing as what like police do to Black and brown people, and that ideology runs from the top to the bottom of our entire government, and we need to fight this white supremacist like international policy in order to like free ourselves of white supremacy as well and to feel connected to the people around the world. And it's also about whose lives matter, right? Like these people that are dying in places that are far away, like we have some stake in it, right? And that they're also our brothers and sisters around the globe, and that, you know, their pain and their suffering should matter and should count as much as the pain and suffering of Americans, right? And so I urge, you know, I find it to be like a moral issue that we should be caring about the suffering of people around the world, especially because it's our government's fault, especially because, you know, who we elect and what we do in this country has dire consequences for people all around the world. So to take that responsibility seriously and to pay attention and to care about people around the world. So that's all I had for slides. Discussion questions, I just had a couple. Any comment on the readings? I thought maybe if anybody has traveled to countries that are impacted by US imperialism, or maybe has some stories from you or your family about some things that you know about the way that sort of United States policy or some of these wars of aggression have impacted you, or anything else that you want to say. Those are just the things. I am going to pause. I'm going to stop the recording real quick and then we can get going.